Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Oonagh Fitzgerald. I'm an artist and an international lawyer, and I'm a senior fellow with the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa and a director of the Canadian branch of the International Law Association. I'm also the editor of CG's newest book, Corporate Citizen: New Perspectives on the Globalized Rule of Law, which explores the legal frameworks and standards of conduct for multinational corporations. Today's virtual event is co-hosted by the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, and the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that CIGI sits on the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. CIGI is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. We also acknowledge the location of the University of Ottawa on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As this is a virtual event, you may be joining us from another traditional territory. I encourage you to do some research to learn more about the land on which you live, work, and play. Today's session focuses on the human rights impacts of multinational corporations, what they are doing to address this issue, and what national governments and international institutions are doing to strengthen corporate accountability. Our lineup of expert panelists will discuss how human rights has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and how corporations have been affected as well. The panelists will consider how government and industry action in the coming months could strengthen socio-economic justice and shape a sustainable recovery from COVID-19. We will be taking questions from the audience via the Q&A function in Zoom. So please do submit your questions by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing the questions in there. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. And in fact, we encourage you to do that so that we have plenty to start with when we open the floor for questions. And we'll certainly do our best to answer as many as we can in the online session, and some maybe by mail, if that's the only way we can do it. So let me tell you a little bit about Corporate Citizen, the book that that inspired this series. Domestic corporate law and international trade and investment law are the handmaidens to globalization, facilitating the growth of global supply chains and the rise of multinational corporations with operations all around the world. These laws provide financial benefits and legal protections for these global corporate citizens, but are not always well designed to hold corporations to account for conduct outside their home jurisdiction. We wrote Corporate Citizen to examine the role of the multinational corporation in today's global economy and to explain how domestic and international law could be strengthened to encourage the development of consistent and enhanced standards of human rights, labor, and environmental conduct. The book examines the modern multinational corporation from many different angles and in a diversity of voices. Written by experts in international economic law, corporate law, investment law, indigenous law, and human rights. The chapters of this book examine how domestic and international laws shape the corporation's freedom to operate globally. The book is arranged in 5 parts. First, it discusses how legal frameworks are straining at the boundaries to address the challenges presented by the evolving multinational corporation. Second, the book looks at how different accountability frameworks are taking shape. Third, it discusses whether corporate conduct sufficiently reflects evolving societal values. Fourth, the book examines how foreign investment obligations are gradually starting to come into focus. Corporate Citizen concludes by examining how institutions are beginning to articulate a tentative vision of transnational justice applicable to multinational corporations. As we were finalizing the book, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered its decision in Nevson Resources versus Araya, providing an interesting hint at what transnational justice might mean. This year, the pandemic has highlighted the interconnectedness and interdependence of global economic, environmental, health, and justice systems. By examining the complexities of the multinational corporation in international law and governance, the book presents the possibility of corporate law reform that strives to align our human need for economic security with our need for justice and human rights, public health, and a healthy natural environment. To learn more about the corporate citizen or to order a copy of the book, please click on the link shared in the chat function. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, John Packer. John is an associate professor of law and director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Over to you, John.
Thanks so much, Oonagh, for those opening remarks and for situating this session, the second session in this wonderful series, attending the launch of this timely book. It's our great pleasure to be collaborating with you personally and with CG in this initiative. Really one of the most timely topics, this session in particular, on human rights and the corporation at a time when much is happening that's both contentious but also very hopeful in terms of some conceptual questions and institutional developments. So we have today, you've already mentioned the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, but there are institutional developments in the country. We are privileged today to have amongst our speakers Sheri Meyerhoffer, the first of a sui generis institution, the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. And at the international level, of course, there are tremendous developments in the context of business and human rights, not least the prospect of a legally binding instrument. So much change potentially is in the offering, and I can't think of a better lineup than we have today, a stellar lineup to address these questions. Quite literally, we have a small handful of speakers, contributors, and I'll just introduce them briefly, and then we'll embark upon the program. So in no particular order, Daniel Fombonne is a senior legal counsel and director of compliance at Kinross Gold, and responsible for the company's global compliance program covering anti-corruption, sanctions, privacy, investigations, and third-party risks. Welcome, Daniel. Then we have Rebecca Johnson, Professor Johnson. She's a professor of law and the associate director of the Indigenous Law Research Unit at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. Rebecca, together with Bonnie Leonard, have co-authored the chapter that's part of the book here, entitled "The Coyote and the Cannibal Boy." Now you'll forgive my mispronunciation here of Secwepemic Insights. I'm sure I'll be corrected on that, on the corporation. So we'll hear not only a bit about that, but much more broadly their insights and approach. Bonnie Leonard, the co-author, is legal advisor for the Assembly of First Nations, and she's going to be contributing from this perspective with Professor Johnson. Then we have Dr. Jason McLean. He's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of New Brunswick. So we're going coast to coast on this. Thanks for everyone, whatever time of day or afternoon it is. He's a co-author. He's also an adjunct professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. So we bring in the prairies. And he's co-author of the chapter in the book entitled Foreign Wrongs, Corporate Rights, and the Arc of Transnational Law, co-authored with Chris Tollefson, who unfortunately is unable to join us today. And then last but definitely not least is Sheri Meyerhoffer, whom I've just mentioned. She was appointed last year and just over a year ago in late spring as Canada's first Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, appointed by the then Minister of International Trade and Diversification, Jim Carr, from my hometown of Winnipeg. You will see in the chat box their fuller bios and possibly links. Each of them has tremendous qualifications, and I think we're really rich in terms of our program today. Now, before turning to the questions, we're just going to give the screen, the microphone, Ombudsperson Sheri Meyerhoffer to give a couple minutes, quick introduction overview about CORE for those who might not be up to speed about it or want to hear a bit more about it, because it is a unique institution, and just so that we get that shared, and then we'll go into the substantive elements. So, Madam Ombudsperson, you have the screen.
Thank you, John, and Oonagh also. And I'd like to thank the CG and the Human Rights Research and Education Center for this opportunity to participate and to introduce the CORE. As John mentioned, I am the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. I'm a lawyer with 17 years experience in the Canadian upstream oil and gas industry, followed by 13 years in the international development sector focused on human rights, rule of law, governance, and access to justice. And before starting my overview of what the CORE, the office that I am creating and will be implementing the mandate, I just want to give a plug for the book, Corporate Citizen. I've read the chapter 10 written by Daniela Chimizo dos Santos. It talks about my office and it being set up. It has some very interesting points to be made, which I encourage you to read. And I'll try to address those in my comments today in ways that we are already trying to address the flags that she raised in that article. But I encourage you to purchase the book and take a read of chapter 10. So I want to look first at what the CORE is. CORE is a federal ombuds office. We receive and review claims of alleged human rights abuses arising from the operations of Canadian companies abroad in the mining, oil and gas, and garment sectors. So just three sectors. It is possible that in the future, some or even all sectors will fall under CORE's mandate, but for the moment, CORE only has jurisdiction over these three. So in the balance of my remarks, when I refer to Canadian companies, I'm not going to repeat the names of those three sectors, but please note that they're implied. So going back to what CORE is a non-judicial dispute resolution mechanism. We represent the public interest in respecting human rights in the operations abroad of Canadian companies. As an impartial ombud, CORE does not represent the complainant or the Canadian company. We work with both parties to try to resolve the problems informally, or if necessary, we will investigate a complaint and where appropriate, we'll make recommendations to remedy a human rights abuse. So by way of historical reference, CORE was created after almost 2 decades of consultations and efforts to demonstrate Canada's commitment to protecting human rights worldwide through an independent, impartial ombud office. Previous corporate social responsibility mechanisms were criticized because they lacked the mandate, independence, and funding necessary to meet Canada's international commitments. CORE's current permanent budget provides for 6 full-time employees, which is 4 more than both of the previous offices. And all of these positions have been filled. And in addition, we have 6 full-time employees, 4 part-time, and 1 student. So right at the moment, we have 17 employees currently focused on assisting CORE fulfill its mandate. We continue to expand other metrics of CORE's arm's length status and independence and are moving forward learning from past experience. And you can look at some of the past experiences in the article that I mentioned in the book. I want to turn now and finally to CORE's mandate. It's set out in an order in Council, which was last updated in September 2019, and it has 4 components. The first 2 components, promote and advise, are proactive tools, and the second 2 components, review and recommend, are reactive. So looking at the proactive tools first, we promote the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. And then we advise Canadian companies operating abroad on their practices and policies related to responsible business conduct. Moving to the reactive components of our mandate, we review alleged abuses of internationally recognized human rights in the operations abroad of Canadian companies and the entities they control. These reviews can arise from complaints filed by individuals, by organizations, and by communities, or it can be initiated by my office and by a self-initiated review. And our second and last reactive tool is to recommend remedies to Canadian companies and others to redress human rights abuses and make recommendations to the Minister of International Trade regarding trade sanctions against Canadian companies, as well as reforms to Canadian policies. With respect to what falls under CORE's mandate to review, it is important to understand two concepts. The first concept, human rights abuses, defines what CORE can review, and the second concept, Canadian companies operating abroad, defines who we can review. The concepts are expressly defined in CORE's Order in Council, which you can find online. But I'll give you some definitions here. So human rights abuse in our OIC is defined as an adverse impact on an internationally recognized human right, including that means, but not limited to, any of the human rights that are referred to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As many of you here today will know, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights includes rights related to environment, labor, health, and safety. So it's quite a broad net. For example, environmental contamination of a local water source, the non-payment of wages, or not providing protective gear to employees during COVID might, depending on the facts, give rise to a human rights abuse under CORE's mandate. I'm going to move now to the definition of Canadian company, and I just want to break down the definition in our Order in Council into simple language. It's a lot more legalistic, and it's even confusing when I break it down simply, but there's 3 levels. So I'll start with that. So when you're listening, 3 levels. So a Canadian company includes a business formed in Canada, either under federal or provincial law. And this includes public and private companies of any size. It also includes other businesses controlled by the Canadian company. And there is control if the Canadian company owns the other business or if the Canadian company has decision-making power over the other business. And this includes subsidiaries. It also includes businesses controlled by the business controlled by the Canadian company. So now we're at level 3. And a Canadian company can include a contractor or subcontractor or another company on its supply chain. And as we know with COVID-19, before COVID-19, but exacerbated by COVID-19, our supply chains are a real focus right now, both of corporations and of governments. So in the interest of time, I'm going to end my introductory comments here so we can move on into what promises to be a very interesting panel discussion. Thanks again for the time.
So thanks for that. That was super succinct and I think sets out very clearly what the challenges are and the scope of the work for your office, which I must say is not only broad, but sounds quite potentially impactful. So we'll look forward to seeing how that all is implemented. So we've organized our conversation today, and we hope it will evolve as a conversation with these 5 great experts around a series of questions. And the way we're going to proceed is I'm going to put the questions and hear the responses from the speakers. And then as we proceed through them, we will open up for comments and questions from the audience. Those can be communicated through the chat function. So I encourage those of you watching to indicate those, and we'll pull them together and then put them to the speakers. The first question is about the current state of affairs of business and human rights. I'll just set it out in these terms, that in recent decades, we could go back further, but certainly in recent decades, there's been growing concern about the human rights impact of multinational or transnational corporations. What are the multinational corporations doing to address this issue? And what are they doing themselves? And what are national and intergovernmental organizations and institutions doing to strengthen corporate accountability? So I'm going to turn first. I'm going to ask Daniel, if he, since he represents a corporation, to respond to that question, and then we'll hear what others have to say.
Thank you, John. Before I get started with my comments, I just want to say it's an honor to be on the panel with all of you, the panelists today. and also that the comments that I'm going to make today are my own, not those of Kinross also, be clear about that. I'm not here as a representative. But in order to address the question, we need to focus, when we see the something that Meyerhoffer said, and focus my brief response on supply chain and human process, because that is the area of risk when we're talking about business human rights, particularly when corporations are operating globally, internationally. So I think that the question that you just raised, John, was twofold, and if I may address the second one first, I think you've seen in the last, particularly in the last decade, the proliferation of legislative and regulatory initiatives globally. And to cite a few examples, the UK Modern Slavery Act, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, and in France, the Loi sur le droit à la diligence, which just got enacted about 3 years ago, are bringing some of that legislative and enforcement push for corporations to really address business and human rights and the impact of human rights when they operate abroad. And I think that certainly will push corporations to respond. I do think that corporations, particularly in jurisdictions where the laws have not been promulgated, have not been enacted so far, are actually responding and are taking the right steps in anticipation for these legislations and regulatory enforcements, but also because it is the right thing to do. I think the ESG space is one that a lot of investors and companies are talking about. It's one that a lot of stakeholders are asking about. So whether that's investors or consumers, if you're a consumer-facing corporation, but also business partners, is generally a hot topic. And as a result, I think corporations are leveraging programs, particularly compliance programs, integrity programs, sustainability programs that they had already developed, and addressing business and human rights. And some of the concrete examples of what they are doing, or should be doing if they are not, and I think they will be for those corporations that are not doing this, is increasing awareness among their employees as to the risks of human rights, impact assessment, human rights impact assessments, risk assessments, ongoing monitoring of their third parties. So as Ms. Meyerhoffer pointed out, and as we were just discussing in terms of the legislation in place, it's really monitoring your third parties, ensuring that it's not just the corporation that's doing the right thing, but that you're also partnering up with business partners that are doing the right thing, but are not having nefarious impact on human rights. So I think that's just some of the reactions that corporations have had in the last few years, and that we will continue to see as the years progress.
Well, thanks for that initial perspective. Of course, it was a little unfair of me to ask you to speak on behalf of all corporations, but insofar as you represent a for-profit corporation in this panel, of course, your corporation comes from a specific field and industry and is narrow in that regard. Let me ask Rebecca and Bonnie. I don't know how you prefer to start. Maybe Rebecca first, but I leave it to you to decide, to put it in a bit broader conceptual framework, and how you might come to this question from your perspective. Who would like to start on that, Rebecca or Bonnie?
Rebecca, you go ahead. I guess I have to, whoever unmutes themselves first usually is the rule. So yeah. Thanks. Thanks, John. The question, one of the things I would sort of place onto the table is how to think about the terms themselves, about what is business doing and what does accountability mean for human rights in these times. And Sheri's initial comments really helped kind of to place some of the big picture things, because like, who are the corporations that we're talking about that are responsible for what human rights violations? So how do we understand the scope of what is human rights in this time and the scope of who is our target? I think about this sometimes when I have conversations with the mother of kind of becoming adult children. And we often have conversations that sound like the government is doing X or the corporation is doing Y. And there's this larger framework that it invites us to ask, which is like, who is this corporate entity? Who is this government, if not also us? So as we think about those questions about accountability for human rights abuses perpetuated by corporations, there is this question, where are we in those larger questions about corporate accountability and about even acknowledging and seeing human rights violations? And it's a particularly pressing question for us in Canada as we grapple with, in kind of on the heels of Truth and Reconciliation, with the question about the underlying structure of our way of theorizing economy. So how to think about the ways that colonialism or colonial patterns of economy have to be a piece of this picture. So part of the conversation as we look out to the world and think about how, for example, me as a University of Victoria employee, my pension fund is deeply, like my pension is deeply invested in mining sector work. And so as we're thinking about accountability, is it only the corporations through the directors? How to think about the rest of us as a piece of that conversation. Yeah.
Let me quickly just react and say, that's extremely important for us to all grasp. I mean, as we're watching, even at a political level, we're watching the US election right now and so forth, these questions about, for example, citizen responsibility for the government, right? The same as shareholder responsibility for the corporation. So kind of being more precise about where responsibility lies and who we're talking about is very important. Bonnie, so how would you frame this?
Thank you, John. First of all, the word is sequepum.
Thank you very much.
Means the people of the spread out territory. So I'm going to give you the sequepum perception on corporate accountability and view it through the lens of an Indigenous person. Accountability for an Indigenous person is first of all to self, and then community, and then nation, as well as the lands and resources on which we rely. And so perhaps a corporation could be interpreted as the nation, and the shareholders are the community members, as are individuals, and the land and resources would be considered corporate wealth, right? So as far as accountability, I think by looking at it with a sequepum perspective, lens, that we find ourselves transcending international governance for the nation, and how that would feed back into corporate accountability as an accountability for traditional governance methodologies as well. And then I think the human rights aspect of this question, just my mind automatically goes to the Indian Act and all of the amendments that followed from the original one, and the statutory implications on the Indigenous people because of the Indian Act and all of those things that it was meant to do as far as colonization. So there really is a huge impact of an intertwining of corporate accountability, human rights, and statutory implications and the sequepum end result, right? So that would be my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. It's really bringing us into a kind of cosmology, actually, which I'm assuming a lot of companies, I mean, Daniel can tell us, but most of his colleagues and so forth, most of my colleagues probably are operating kind of presumed frameworks without that level of depth. That's a fascinating perspective. Jason, do you want to give us a view from your perspective? And I know working particularly on environmental and sustainability issues.
Sure. Thanks, John. Well, I mean, I think at a broad level, we should just put on the table that the record of transnational corporations when it comes to human rights, including environmental human rights and climate justice, is abysmal. It's not anywhere where it needs to be, and I don't think we can really proceed without putting that on the table. I think the challenge at a high level of abstraction is to figure out how to navigate between, on the one hand, simply decrying the record and assuming or even arguing that positive change is difficult or even impossible on the one hand, without lapsing into a kind of simplistic cheerleading with respect to this and that particular initiative by this or that corporation or this or that regulatory initiative. That's really the challenge, is to figure out how to think and act constructively in that space. And for me, an example that I've been working on and studying for the last 6 months or so is Amazon.com's climate pledge and the ongoing response to that pledge by a group of Amazon employees who have branded themselves as the Amazon Employees for Climate Justice. And so what's really fascinating about this give and take is that you have, on the one hand, a pledge and a commitment made by a transnational corporation, a very powerful and influential one, Amazon, that on its face, for those who aren't actually steeped in climate change policy and climate change science, looks really ambitious and looks really progressive. And to be sure, parts of it actually are. On the other hand, the response by Amazon's Employees for Climate Justice, demanding that the company be yet more ambitious and also attend to the environmental racism dimensions of climate change, including the intersection with COVID-19, allow for an added level of transparency and a critical lens that we can bring to that kind of a corporate pledge. And I think that, the idea of not just looking at shareholders, but beginning to broaden our view to stakeholders and citizens coming to work at transnational corporations, increasingly making political demands on those transnational corporations to be different and to do different things, I think is an exciting example of where we might engage in that space between just dismissive critique on the one hand and simplistic cheerleading that we tend to see in corporate media on the other.
So we're getting a sense already of complexity, right? Of overlapping, multiple kind of dimensional interests and so forth. The questions put in kind of what are corporations doing and what's kind of happening at the national intergovernmental organizational level. So Sheri, you in fact hold the position of something that is happening in institutional development at a national level, but with transnational reach. And at the same time, you are exactly purposefully to be impartial. So not the corporation, nor specifically an advocate of the beneficiaries. And I guess in a classic ombuds type role, to help make things better. So what's your take on this question?
Yes, thanks, John. So you kind of preempted, my shameless ongoing promotion of my office. Thank you very much. But so, of course, on this question, I'm focused on what national governments are doing to strengthen corporate accountability. And of course, for me, the example is the creation, the establishment of the core. And that's, a very important step, I think, that Canada, this national government, has taken to strengthen corporate accountability. And I just want to say that CORE is not only Canada's response to the recommendations of the United Nations, so the international, bodies out there who are saying we have to do more. So we're not just following their recommendations in the area of business and human rights, but we're actually, with the CORE office, attempting to improve upon previous and an existing, not just in Canada, but in other countries, bodies or mechanisms, by providing CORE with some interesting powers. And that is our unique power to review, including the power to investigate alleged human rights abuses, whether through a complaint, that's one way, but we can also self-initiate a review. So that's very potentially powerful, and we can look at and address systemic issues, incorporating all of the perspectives that have been brought out here, the corporate perspective, the Indigenous perspective, the worker perspective, investors, etc. So that's really important. If you read the chapter in the book in chapter 10, of course, there are some concerns about our body and how it's been set up. And so the actual, strength of the core with these expanded powers, these additional things, has not yet been mapped. But I have to say they do provide additional next step, world first potential. This is what we're dealing with here. And it's a potential which my office intends to vigorously explore. So, and we do know that in that exploration, we need to impartially look at all the perspectives that the other panelists are putting out there today.
Yeah, so that's there's an opening, and that's an encouraging step, as you say, from one government and limited to specific spheres of enterprise. But that's a step forward, and we'll see how that evolves. And undoubtedly, we all wish much success. So now we've got 5 different kind of takes, if I can say, or perspectives on this question. Do any of you wish to pose questions to or comment on the remarks of each other? You're more than welcome just to raise your hand or let me know. Can I ask Bonnie, since you represent also as a legal advisor the Assembly of First Nations, so also let me say in a protected and intended beneficial group, would you have a comment on Daniel's initial statement in terms of a for-profit corporation?
I'm afraid I can't comment on that from the AFN perspective. I'm not the spokesperson, and I would be stepping out of my line of authority if I did that. Sorry.
Very good, and my apologies for not taking account of that. But perhaps more broadly, and I see Rebecca's hand up because she is, of course, just an independent scholar.
Academics, we can say whatever we want because
exactly, yeah.
Because my husband would say because nobody cares. But so I mean, one of the kind of the underlying things that maybe I'd go back to that. So at UVic right now, the university has started this new program, the JD-JID. So this is a transformation in legal education designed to put Indigenous legal orders and Canadian common law legal orders into conversation with each other through a 4-year degree instead of a 3-year degree, like the McGill civil law common law model. And the reason I just want to put that into this conversation is because we have huge questions about actually sovereignty and entire legal orders that are underneath this that raise big, big questions about even whether or not the state, how to think about the state's authority to even make legislation about how we work on unceded Indigenous territory, if we'd say, like from the Canadian perspective. But it's like a big kerplunk stick sometimes in this discussion. Like if you pull that stick out, the underlying assumptions of sovereignty that are in this from the beginning, there's this kind of feeling of terror, like the whole thing will fall apart and all the work people have done to try and scaffold a world of human rights protection risks falling apart. One approach to this kerplunk stick problem is to think about what it would mean to really transform our thinking, to look at how to think seriously about how to put these kinds of ways of legal orders in conversation with each other. So how to have these conversations that where we have to hold that really big, huge sovereignty piece present, but also say, how are we going to actually do the work of moving forward to begin to build different kinds of relationships? So I think Sheri's office in some ways is kind of taking up that question, how to have the proactive and the reactive. Daniel's kind of taking up some of the questions about what it looks like to try and make some of those moves from the inside. Jason's alerting us to kind of the ways that if we don't take those things up, we sidestep. And I think the hard piece for all of us right now is to think about what might it mean for us to be able to start engaging with the Indigenous legal orders, resources and tools and approaches to engage with this, which isn't to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's to take really seriously how to place Indigenous law on the table, not as a perspective, but as actually a foundational legal set of legal orders that have resources, right? They're not without resources to help us think about imaginaries that might give us additional scaffolds to look at partnership and building, because corporations at the end of the day are invented confabulations that we talk about them as if they're legal persons. They're going to act as if they're legal persons, but they're legal persons that don't have the normal restraints. The rest of us don't have those either, right? We're all hungry, ravenous, cannibalistic creatures in our nature. But how to take that seriously in how we kind of really work with each other? Yeah, I think that's can we hold together the danger and the absolute necessity of using languages of partnership to make this conversation really practical about all the ranges of tools people can bring to bear from all the places they're situated. Yeah.
So there's a lot of really mind and practically challenging elements in that. Bonnie, I want to come back to you in just a moment, not right now, but I'll just on this sovereignty question and the kind of conceptualization of that notion. In public international law, sovereignty basically means exclusive jurisdiction. That's essentially its content, to be quick about it. But we know, if we think about the way the world's organized in terms of prevailing jurisdiction and so forth, we have these theories about the state. And if we actually look about it, so we usually say from a human rights perspective that the primary responsibility rests with the state. And that responsibility arises from contracted obligations, whether treaty-based and so forth. So therefore, an effort to create a new treaty on a legally binding instrument and so forth. But we also know that real capacities of states are wanting. And at one level, a lot of states are not even near the capacities of, for example, foreign investors who have a greater capacity. So I'm veering in this way back to Daniel, thinking, if you will think about, for your company, for example, the kind of simple analysis of pursuit of profit and the theory that well-being is served by a free enterprise that generates productivity and outputs and improves our world in some way. But how is your company thinking about this in the kind of complex terms we're talking about and working in different jurisdictions where capacities may not be up to it and so forth? Is this affecting your kind of approach? And similarly, I want to cede a little bit for Jason, because when we talk about environment and so forth, we're now talking about things which simply exceed any state's capacity on their own. I mean, the concept of exclusive jurisdiction of any state on some, climate change issues is a kind of nonsensical premise. So it begs a lot of questions about responsibility of kind of global transnational level and the role of different actors. So Jason, I'll come back to you in a moment, but Daniel, can you say something about your own company and how companies like your own company are thinking about this?
Sure. I think essentially when Canadian companies are operating globally, they are guests in communities. They're guests in host communities. They have a social license to operate, but that social license is granted by the sovereign or by the, we were talking about more of a state construct by the host communities, whether those are local, provincial, national. And as such, I think it really comes back to a point that Rebecca made. It's a dialogue, it's a partnership. It's one that I think even, I know I'm representative of the for-profit corporation today, so I'll speak on behalf of the for-profit corporation. But, while, obviously the goal of a for-profit corporation is profit, I do think there are others, other goals of those corporations And it depends on the stakeholder within that corporation, to be perfectly honest. So employees within that corporation have their own goals, separate and distinct from the corporation itself. But what I will say is, and to address your question, John, I think it comes back to I guess the proactive piece that Rebecca was underlining, which is we really need to facilitate the dialogue. We need to, where there are governance gaps, and I think we'll get to this in the next phase of our discussion, because some of those gaps have emerged during the pandemic. It's continuing the dialogue, continuing the partnership, and ensuring that the various stakeholders, whether it's the sovereign or the corporation, are working together to ultimately achieve the right goals, right? Which is working for everyone, really, whether that's the corporation. And again, I know there are different paradigms of what a corporation is, as Bonnie correctly pointed out earlier. But whether it's the individuals within that corporation. So I'm not sure if I totally addressed your question, but I think we have and I think we'll get further down this line, we have a path to ameliorating the situation right now. I think it's a perfect opportunity for that.
Muted again. So Jason, what's your reflection on these kind of by character transnational, even global issues?
Thanks, John. I think it's a great question because, in the Anthropocene, it is just a blunt fact that transnational corporations are major actors with major impact. At the same time, we have to recognize constructively that they have major capacity. So then the question becomes, can we enlist the capacity of transnational corporations to assist states, but local communities, indigenous nations in the transformation that is desperately and urgently required in order to meet the challenges of climate change, of environmental injustice, and even the challenges before us more immediately, which arise out of climate change, something like COVID-19. But so all that sounds good and fine, and I think it's true at that level of abstraction. But we also have to remember part of the struggle, and in my view, this is going to be a struggle. I used to represent corporations like the one that Dan works for. We used to do it at the same firm together in slightly different ways. And one of the key fault lines right now is that corporations are lawmakers. They're not just or even primarily law takers, but they're lawmakers. And when it comes to climate pledges and human rights pledges, and even beginning to embrace broader notions of stakeholder capitalism, although that's a very live debate within the corporate sector, one of the sort of the unspoken but always present fault line is whether this is going to be legally binding or this is going to be voluntary. And I think that's an important tension to keep on the table in terms of trying to figure out greater drivers of accountability. It's an extremely difficult problem, but a transnational corporate governance of the environment or of human rights paradigm that's remains based on corporations doing just as much as they like, but no more, and carving out exception after exception after exception. I go back to the case study I mentioned with respect to Amazon.com and its initial pledge, its climate pledge to become carbon neutral by the year 2040, 10 years earlier than the date stipulated by the Paris Agreement, so bragged the company. When you look into the fine print of Amazon.com's climate and sustainability plans, a completely different picture emerges in terms of what its climate impact is and how it right now alone chooses to even define and measure its climate impact. So in many ways, our transnational governance mechanisms are just completely inadequate to be able to deal with this. But there's no getting through this. I don't think there's any way of moving to the other side where we are seriously embarking on a just transition to sustainability and resilience without somehow enlisting the capacity of transnational corporations. But it is right now, it's a chasm that we have to cross in terms of conceptually and in terms of action.
Well, I remember reading also that even before Jeff Bezos, became worth 200 billion or whatever he is now, that even some years ago, some individuals and certainly corporations like Apple and others are worth more than the combined GDP, national GDP of all or most African countries. So there's a kind of huge gap also in terms of just power, or and makes us, I think, reflect upon, not only who they are, but these kind of questions of sovereignty. So coming back to that, I was suggesting, Bonnie, you say something about sovereignty. Do you want to comment on that, or do you have something else you'd like to say in this conversation?
No, I've been thinking about it since you raised it with me, and the term sovereignty is very essential for those nations that have treaties with Canada. I come from a nation that did not enter a treaty. I come from central British Columbia. There are no treaties there. There are some historical treaties on Vancouver Island. There's 14 of them. They call them the Douglas Treaties. But for the most part, and then Treaty 8 in the northeastern part of British Columbia. There's Treaty 8 that spans the Alberta-BC border. But for the most part, and then there's modern treaties under the BC treaty process. So sovereignty is a really an interesting issue for my nation, in that we've never signed a treaty. Other nations across Canada obviously have, but with the impacts of colonialism, assimilation, and basically the Canadian educational system, the whole curriculum is pretty much void of a real history component, because the history didn't start when the settlers got here. And a lot of people are taught that in school, that's when history started, when they made contact. Well, that's not how it was. So we have thousands of years of history that we've maintained as Secwepemc people, as a nation, and our history is held in the stories. Our stories, like our oral traditions, those were, and that's the work we do with Rebecca at UVic, as we look at our stories and we distill it down and say, okay, what was the law here? Because that's where our laws are. That's where our social factors, those things that are important to our people, they're contained within the stories, and you just have to look. We were very fortunate in the early 1900s to have James Tate come through our territory and learn our language and work with our people to actually transcribe some of the stories, because I think many of them, as a result of schools, would have been lost had it not been for his recordings. But there's so many more out there that our people still hold. Families hold stories and they share them in the winter. That's part of our tradition. So back to the issue of sovereignty, we're very fortunate in my territory because we've never given that up. We've never signed a treaty. We've always maintained our jurisdiction. A good example of this is one of our communities in Splatseen, which is sort of near the Enderby, Armstrong area in British Columbia, if you know that. In the 1980s, that community asserted its jurisdiction under a bylaw. It tucked it under the Indian Act, mind you, but they still did it over child welfare. And they just said, no, we have jurisdiction over our children and families, and we're going to be asserting it. They have done this for over 40 years. They're outside of the delegated agencies, Ministry of Child and Family in BC. They're outside of that process, and they're respected. They've had to go to court a few times to push back when the province tried to take their children. But like, this is a really good example of an assertion of sovereignty, and the practice on the ground is my point on that. Yeah, I think that's all I could say. Thank you.
Sheri, just while we wrap up this question, if you have a comment, again, you're in an unusual position as an ombudsperson, not exactly executive, so-called fourth branch, some people say, a government, but also dealing with this I wonder if you've given some thought to dealing with this kind of substantial inequality of actors.
Yeah, I mean, so thanks, John. It's a good question. And an ombuds's office, an ombud is really there to balance the imbalance of power. And, you know, that'll be different in every situation. So, I mean, that is going to be part of the flexibility of the organization that we're creating, because those power imbalances, some of them are obvious. You might always be where the corporation we could perceive has greater power, and that's who we're dealing with. But I think, you know, the power of the state, or the lack of power of a state, is also like contextualizing these things. When we're in a certain country, where is there an imbalance between the company and the state? And what impact does that have on the person whose human rights have been, negatively impacted? I just want to say to Rebecca and Bonnie, we are looking a lot at, you know, what is happening in Canada with respect to Indigenous law and Indigenous practices, and in the context, of land and those other issues, because we know that, you know, a lot of the examples from around the world that will probably come to us are highly likely to be on Indigenous lands in other countries. So how are we going to Canada is different from everywhere else, but Indigenous also has, a milieu that we are going to need to tap into. So our intention is definitely to be working with, the Assembly of First Nations and other Indigenous scholars, legal scholars, to make sure that we're applying the right concepts and taking in conceptualizing things appropriately.
Well, and just on that point, there's a recent important decision of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, specifically recognizing essentially the sovereignty of Indigenous group, and this is basically the evolving international law. So that's another element to keep track of here, which will be very interesting. And that, by the way, is an interpretation also of the Inter-American Declaration on Human Rights, and therefore applicable in Canada. Let's move on to the second question. Of course, we can't ignore the overarching effect and impact now of COVID-19. This is kind of all-encompassing. It is global by its character. It exceeds any single state on its own being able to respond to it, and the character of a pandemic. So my question is, for the COVID-19 impacts on business and human rights, it's obviously having a serious impact on pretty much everyone. What is the role of the corporation with regard to the challenges of COVID-19 in your views? And I'll start again with Daniel.
So, I think it goes without saying that what we've seen in the last 9-10 months is when big issues like the pandemic come about, you often see where the governance gaps lie. And I think you can see that economically, societally, and you've seen because of those governance gaps. Unfortunately, you've seen a string of issues. But I think I'd also underline that there have been positives. I think you've seen a multi-stakeholder approach to solving some of the big issues that have arisen as well. So a case in point being vaccine development, where you have industry partnering up with governments. So I think that's the positive. Unfortunately, when governance, I think generally there are governance issues, and I think they just come to the fore during these times of tension. You also see nefarious actors, unfortunately, benefiting from that. Concrete examples being, and again, I think Sheri started this conversation at the outset with supply chain and procurement risks. I think you've seen it. Even in our own backyard, the federal government, unfortunately, falling foul to fraud. I think it was 10 million masks that they procured through a broker in Montreal, turned out to be junk. And that's taxpayer money that's literally thrown out. I think the risks are obviously highly increased when you have a pandemic or have a big issues. I think processes and protocols that generally people think work will be demonstrated not to work if they're not actually properly implemented. Role of corporations would be to solve the big issues. And I'm not really addressing the specific question. I think I'm more underlining the challenges that have occurred with the pandemic. But I think there's in the moment there's a role for-profit corporations, if you would, and all types of corporations, to really partner up with other stakeholders and address the gaps and the issues. And then I think there's also a role for the future. And again, I'm leading to I think some of our later discussion, John, but I think there's a role as well for what, the corporations have done and have seen to address those governance gaps and plug that gap for the future. So I think that's some of the roles the corporation can play. It's a big, broad question. I think, obviously I'll yield my time to the others because I'm sure they have some good opinions on this question.
Yeah, I mean, the corporation, of course, and as Sheri's office, as she set out in terms of the scope of her office, it's public and private corporations. And there are all sorts of corporations. I mean, I work for a corporation, the university. So, we're hard to escape corporations. It's the nature of our organization. Bonnie, I'm wondering, one of the things we've seen of COVID-19 is the considerable disproportionate impact on certain populations, communities, and the Indigenous peoples, certainly in Canada, I think in most parts of the world, appear to have been particularly badly affected. What's your view on the role or the impact of COVID-19 on business and human rights, particularly for Indigenous peoples, but maybe more broadly?
I think the role of a corporation during these interesting times would be to adapt to, and maybe this is a simplistic view, but I see it happening on the ground practically, to adapt to provide essential services to the vulnerable and the general population so they can continue to earn their profits. But a good example of this is in Oonagh E. There's a company called Thompson Distillery. They made alcohol products prior to this pandemic. When the pandemic hit, they invested in their company business to change the equipment that makes alcohol to instead produce hand sanitizers. I mean, this is a First Nation, an Indigenous business, and it made the change that was necessary to assist everyone, really. Anyone can buy their product. But that was just one example, I think, that where a corporation has a moral obligation to change the way it does business in order to support those who are vulnerable. I think that's the role of the corporation during a pandemic. As far as the increase in numbers in our communities, that's a result of years and years of underfunding and neglect by the Canadian government. So I'll just slam the government and stop at that, because I think we all know why.
Well, just to pick up the point about the corporation adjusting to needs, and of course the corporation has its for-profit interests, but we can also think about the corporation here in terms of just an instrument of organizational and productive capacity, and so there's all sorts of different ways in which the corporation can be structured, but also deployed. Jason, what's your take on this?
Thanks, John. I mean, I don't want to be, I guess I'm growing into the role of the panel's naysayer. So it's true that there is this enormous capacity, but there's also a number of examples of corporations really failing to rise to the challenge of embracing stakeholder capitalism. I'll go back to my favorite running theme for today, which is Amazon. So for one thing, I mean, okay, we're focusing on COVID-19, and that's important and it's topical. But at the same time, COVID-19 is not separate from the climate crisis. In fact, in many ways, it arises out of it and is exacerbated by it. So one of the things that the Amazon employees for climate justice have done is that they have begun to demand that Amazon improve conditions in their central distribution warehouses, where there's quite a bit of air pollution due to the use of large fleet vehicles. And these distribution warehouses tend to be located in vulnerable marginal communities. And so we've got scientific data now that shows that air pollution actually exacerbates the risks and conditions for COVID-19. So there's a concrete case of where they come together. And yet Amazon is refusing to do so. In fact, in France, a union took Amazon to court in the early days of COVID-19, demanding that Amazon cease distributing non-essential items until a comprehensive safety assessment was undertaken in consultation with the union. And they succeeded in court and succeeded on appeal. But the fact that the unions had to take Amazon to court to essentially say, we need to stop with the distribution of non-essential items until we can ensure safety in the warehouses is not a great story of a transnational corporation rising to the occasion. The most recent demand being made by the Amazon employees for climate justice is that they get a paid day off to vote in the United States. So Amazon employs over 600,000 people in the United States. Voting in the United States, as I'm sure everyone who's been following the upcoming election knows, is not exactly an easy process under normal times. And so far, Amazon has simply refused to even respond to the demand of its employees to be able to have some form of paid leave in order to be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So, it's a difficult question. I think what we're seeing in a number of corporations, not just Amazon, but a number of the tech corporations in particular, and not just with respect to climate, but with respect to issues of freedom of speech and racism and misogyny, is a battle that is beginning to be contested within corporations about what they're going to be about. So notwithstanding, rhetoric about a stakeholder model, that's not the model that we have. So it's a stakeholder model when corporations choose to embrace those values. But going back to my earlier point, corporate lawyers are hostile to the idea, maybe not Dan, but most corporate lawyers are hostile to the idea that we can translate these broader fiduciary stakeholder duties into law. And I think that's more a telling example of where the transnational corporation is at the moment, vis-a-vis these existential crises that we're facing.
So I'm hearing from you that the role of corporation, it's certainly contestable, but it's also kind of in flux. And on the one hand, there's those defending a kind of status quo, let me say backward looking, not backward in the underdeveloped sense, but retrospective kind of, and others who are thinking, well, we need to go forward. So Rebecca, do you have something that you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, I'm just thinking about the question of history replicating itself in time, the sort of pressures that we feel at this particular moment. And certainly this particular COVID moment has made visible a whole bunch of, we'll call them like human rights issues that are really related often, that show themselves up through precarity along lines of gender, along lines of race. So we're seeing this kind of pattern. But that pattern is a historic pattern that we see about about certain vulnerabilities that emerge in very particular ways, and that are usually, I want to call them relational vulnerabilities. So even in the university, it's very clear now that women academics are having different problems. So women academics, productive capacity is dropping, and many of their male counterparts is increasing at the same moment. So it's the Amazon problem, right? Again, like somebody is benefiting, and part of the benefit is because of other relational obligations that people are taking on. So people who are caring for children, for elderly people, for neighbors, for communities. So what sort of becomes visible in this moment is how many relationships of care and nurturance are crucial for sustaining life on a planet. This is also about, plant life. In what ways does water become now hyper visible? In what ways do the forests become visible? Do the plants become visible? Do the animals become visible? So what we see in this moment are long-term patterns of relationship that come visible to us precisely in this moment of pandemic, but are there all the time. So Bonnie's example is really lovely because what it shows is then, okay, the corporation, it's able to respond to the extent that it is already aware of its nestedness in all of these other relations so that it can move and respond in ways that take up relationship. And so it's this relationship piece that I think Bonnie was pointing to in terms of Secwepemc legal resources, because when you have a 10,000-year legal history, you have many pandemics, you have glaciers, you have floods, you have famines. So the legal resources, and this is partly what we take up in our chapter. So if I were doing the chapter plug, it would be, this is the question that we take up using a Secwepemc legal resource to ask, like, this is not the first pandemic. You know, not even within 100 years is it the first pandemic. It's not the first, it won't be the last. And so the pressure to theorize everything like it's emergence and sudden and we've got no models keeps us unable to respond in helpful ways. So these kinds of questions of history and looking back can help us to see how in these older resources, and the Cannibal Boy story in particular that we look at from the Secwepemc legal tradition, asks us a couple of things. One is to note how when we have a cannibal in our midst, the more it eats, the bigger it grows. We have different challenges for accountability, different challenges for monitoring, and different challenges for pulling it back. So the resource helps us think about the different ways that we would respond to an Amazon or a Walmart and the organization in Kanawaki, because we also keep tending to talk as if multinational corporations means something specific. And just as we have this diversity within, you know, human actors, we also have scale and scope matters to us. So rather than only focusing on the stopping, it's what are the tools to enable both those entities and ourselves to have multiple strategies around things so that we can better respond when we're in different kinds of moments of crisis that are very deeply rooted into notions of relationship. Like relationality matters for the possibility of us working our way through this in a helpful way.
Lots of great insights there. Thanks, Rebecca. I can certainly confirm, and my own faculty, the self-evidently unequal effects of COVID on the basis of gender. And, you know, we've tried to address that, but I think inadequately so far. Sheri, I know it's, again, you have this unique role. I'm thinking about how you will see the corporation. I mean, if we're speaking about the corporation in kind of generic terms, I mean, there may be complaints received by groups that are manifest in a corporate body. And at the same time, of course, you have enterprises that might not be technically corporate and so forth. How do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm going to refer back to my mandate and to the guidelines that I'm following. So the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights says the role of the company is to respect human rights. So that's the role of the company. That's the answer to that question. Of course, we know, though, that, you know, COVID-19 exacerbates the existing inequalities, as Rebecca pointed out, right? So we know that in the garment industry, which is one of my industries, it mostly employs women. So when there's shutdowns or anything happens, that's going to negatively, disproportionately impact women. And that's the case in other industries too. The businesses also encounter conflicting human rights needs. So they have to respect the right to a livelihood. So to provide jobs, or, you know, like that's if they're making a profit to provide a job. But at the same time, they have to respect the right to health. So is that workplace healthy? And they've got to balance these things, you know, so you employ less people because you don't have enough space. I mean, these are conflicting rights, but there's no hierarchy of rights, as we've learned. They're all equal, and how do companies and corporations address those? And so I really, there's been so many interesting things said by everybody. I'm just nodding here. But Bonnie, you pointed out that, you know, the idea of adaptation. And I just want to say that COVID-19 requires corporations to adapt and innovate in order to survive in business while maintaining their critical global role in respecting human rights. So they have to continue to respect, but it's going to require adaptation, and whether that's producing different products or how they treat their employees or what they need to be aware of. And there's new things that they need to be aware of. And so to assist companies, what the Corps has already done is we created a series of 8 fact sheets that deal with different, we've got 8 different areas of human rights. And we're going to be publishing those soon on our website, so keep your eye open on the website. That will help guide and assist companies that are working abroad in the 3 sectors that we have a mandate over. Address how are they going to practically address these conflicting issues or these inequalities. I just want to give an example on our fact sheet on equality and non-discrimination. We look at the company's role to ensure that their work measures are clear and consistent and do not favor or exclude workers. So this comes down to something Rebecca said, on the basis of ethnicity, race, gender, age, health status, etc. So the companies have to be really, really focused on that and make sure that what they're doing doesn't have exacerbate those inequalities. So anyway, I just would refer you to those fact sheets, and it covers a lot of areas. But that's one way is companies do have to realize this exacerbates existing problems. Their obligation remains the same, so they need to adapt. And I think that's where the innovation comes in. How are they going to adapt?
So that's a beautiful segue. Our third question was so looking forward in terms of envisaging roles, specifically in terms of a post-COVID-19 world, a recovery. But I think, as Jason's also pointed out, and as we also heard from Rebecca and Bonnie, this is not the first pandemic, even in the last 20 years, even affecting Canada with SARS and other things. So this is the nature of the world in which we live in. I'd like you to think about this question, business and human rights and a COVID-19 recovery with the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and many other great plans being kind of thrown off track. The World Bank and others saying we're going to have a kind of global 5% loss of GDP, and in many places much, much greater than that, and the disproportionate impact in different places of substantial GDP drop and so forth. How do you envisage governments and corporate sector working to strengthen socioeconomic justice and shaping the recovery? I'm not going to go to you straight on the question because we only have about 10 or 11 minutes left, and there's been a number of people trying to ask some questions. So what I'm going to ask is, I'm going to ask Bonnie if you can start us off with a kind of vision going forward, 1 or 2 minutes, and then I'm going to share with you a couple questions from the audience. Okay, Bonnie.
Sure. Yeah. As far as the impacts of COVID on justice in general, the area of the law that I work in is child welfare, and I'm doing some work for my nation right now in drafting a law for our nation using C-92, or the federal act that was recently in force in January, to springboard into the jurisdiction realm. So the impacts on justice have been from COVID, have basically ground the work to a halt. It's Canada is not implementing C-92. They're really slow out of the gate. They've set up tables for us where we go to the table and we have a discussion, but no one at the table seems to know what to do, even when we tell them, here's what you need to do. So as far as impacts on justice, I think the pandemic has been brutal. And another aspect of this as well is children in care and the inability to access where they're in a foster home, but the parents aren't allowed to come visit because of the pandemic. So I think as far as justice is concerned, this is just the tip of an iceberg, what we're experiencing presently. And I think coming out of this and moving forward, we're going to feel these impacts in the area of justice for years to come. It is going to be a lot of mental health issues are going to come out of this. I think that we're going to be really challenged on recovering from the impacts of it.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that this is going to have a long-term and potentially, I'm rather optimistic. The challenges are of such a nature that we better respond positively, or we're going to be seriously lost. So in some respects, it's a positive challenge. I have a few questions that are kind of a bit precise. I want to share them. One for you, Sheri, is looking forward. Canada's, in terms of developing a national action plan on business and human rights. What is specifically to be CORE's role? So, an institutional actor. Are you part of it? Do you have a particular view on that?
I mean, I'm assuming it's the National Action Plan under the OECD guidelines. So that's really led by the National Contact Point and with the Department of International Trade, Business and Human Rights Division. But of course, we do play a role because that impacts on us. That gives us, that provides us with evidence or a marker or something to refer to and hold, companies accountable to. So we will definitely, it's part of, you can imagine, you can probably expect to see a recommendation from us that, Canada, move forward in developing that. And that we will also contribute, make recommendations to the contents of that. So that would be our contribution to that.
Thanks for that direct response. Bonnie, I want to come back to you with another question from the audience, which perhaps puts clearly this kind of clash of worldviews. The question is about Indigenous peoples demanding a change of the extractive economic model towards one that prioritizes life and in respective environment. Probably even the word extraction is an odious term in that regard. And so the question is, what's the viability of this Indigenous people's demand for such a change in the context of COVID-19 pandemic? I guess the implication there is that with resources, finances, and everything else under more constraint, how can this move forward? Do you have a comment on that?
I think, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think we really need to turn our minds to remediation type of industry. I appreciate that there's not a great deal of money there, but there are supports for it. What I see from my territory is a huge waste in the forestry industry. They go in, they selectively pick the best trees and leave the rest on the ground. Big piles get put up and it gets burnt. Our people aren't even allowed to go in and harvest it for firewood. In the mining industry, again, in my territory, there's already 2 mines near the city of Kamloops. They tried to open another one called Ajax Mine. Our nation fought back, and we did our own environmental assessment in our own traditional way. And our people were involved in that along the way. There was witnesses called, traditional people, knowledge. We did our own environmental assessment, and we said, and the decision was clear, no, that mine cannot be developed there. That's another area where that mine is the Trout Children's story, Rebecca. That's where it came from, was like, it's called Jacko Lake now, but there's a story connected to it. There's a deep and meaningful connection to our people and our law for that area, and we couldn't allow it to be destroyed for the purposes of an economic development like a mine. And I've always thought about mining in the sense that, why do we have to do it all now? Can't we leave some, like, I always think of it like the earth is a bank. Can we leave some there for maybe future generations and just, deal with what we've got and clean up the messes we've made? For instance, Mount Polley, the tailings dam spill up near Williams Lake. It was a disaster, and it's going to be a disaster for many years to come, but there is no focus on cleanup. So there needs to be some obligation put on corporation for the remediation work. And I think that's where our government is failing in policy and in law, is they're not enforcing or creating those obligations. In our way, what we do traditionally, it's a reciprocal relationship. all our stories have this sort of law that's embedded in us, reciprocal. So if you take something, you got to give something back. And I think that's what's missing right now.
Thanks for that thought. I think that sounds like good advice and wisdom of a broad value. I'm not going to ask these questions, but I'm just going to say two questions we have and leave them for the rest of the audience to take away and for us all to have in our minds. A couple other questions that I think are challenging. One is, how does a corporation mesh its responsibility to its investors? I presume here as private for-profit investors, with its responsibility for human rights, the environment, sustainability, and so forth. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And a second question I'll just read out is, how can corporations contribute to the fulfillment of the obligation of states, the primary duty, to respect the rights of prior consultation, of free and informed consent? That's a specific right of Indigenous peoples, but I think more broadly, for example, minorities. And in that regard, I will say that I understand from my own international work, this was a contribution that came out of Canadian experience and is something that would go a long way, I think, to helping improve things. We only have a few minutes left, so let me just say thanks to our wonderful panel and all the contributors. I'm sorry that we've run out of time and not a last minute from each of you. I'm going to invite Dr. Fitzgerald to just say a few words before we have to wrap at the end. But thanks for everyone. And for the audience, you can follow the work of our panelists. You can Google them. You can look at the links online and feel free to do so. Thanks to everyone. Over to you, Dr. Fitzgerald.
Hi, John. Thank you for a wonderful panel. Excellent moderation. It was such a flowing discussion about so many important issues. And I think the audience will have appreciated how you brought so many different perspectives into this discussion and I think suggested ways in which these panelists and the people they work with on a daily basis could really contribute working together to kind of reconceive what the corporation will be going forward as we find our way out of this. I love the appeal back into history to learn from that and just hearing how much is going on in the institutions such as the core and also in the corporate sector to try and address these issues. So there's a lot being done. There's still a lot of challenges, as Jason and Rebecca have pointed out, but this was a great conversation. I really hope that we can keep it going because there's so much to do. Thank you for your excellent moderation.
Thanks for all the contributors. It was a great pleasure. Take care, and I would just say watch this space. There are 2 more sessions coming up in November, so watch for notices through CG, and you'll probably hear from us through social media and otherwise. Otherwise, take care, stay well.